In this section, we'll introduce the New Left and look at how it began, its roots with the SDS and the free speech movement. The New Left was, in a general sense, a broad political and cultural movement of the 1960s that sought to address a number of problems it saw in American society. Now, while in many ways it sought an activist government to address these concerns and thus fit into traditional liberalism, indeed, the old left would be the New Deal, the New Left had a broader critique of both society and government. It was as much a cultural movement as a political movement. It not only included the civil rights movement and feminism and the anti-Vietnam War movement, all, by the way, I mentioned in other lectures. It also involved the rejection of society's materialism and consumerism, and rather embraced what became known as the counterculture. And as such, some elements of the New Left rejected politics and societal reform altogether and sought to escape from society. Again, you have to understand the New Left was a broad movement and even had some elements, by the way, in Europe. The New Left was, of course, related to the baby boom's maturation, the prosperity of the post-war years, and the perceived blandness and conformity in post-war society. It found its greatest strength in college-age students from the middle and upper classes. They didn't have to worry about where their next meal was coming from or their own economic security. They could focus on the broader wrongs in society. Indeed, some of the leaders of the New Left were from the nation's elite universities. They're often graduate students or liberal arts majors. If you want to look at the foundations intellectually for the New Left, you have to go back to the labor and Marxist and some of the philosophers that were writing in the late 19th and early 20th century at the time of American progressivism. At the middle of the 20th century, however, you can find C. Wright Mills at Columbia University. He was a sociologist there, and he wrote what became known as the Letter to the New Left. It was an open letter he published in the 1960s. And what he said was there's a tremendous overlap between society's elites and the economic and political structure of the nation. And activists shouldn't focus on labor issues, but should broaden their concerns to the alienation of the majority of the masses and the authoritarians of these elites. Wright Mills died in 1962, but his writings were an inspiration to the New Left. One of the earliest organizations of the New Left was the Students for a Democratic Society, or the SDS. Tracing its roots back to the Student League for Industrial Democracy, which itself went all the way back to the early 20th century and the Progressive Age reforms, the SDS first formed in 1960 at the University of Michigan campus in Ann Arbor, Michigan. At that time, the group elected Alan Haber its first president. The SDS soon grew and had several chapters, and it then adopted a political manifesto known as the Port Huron Statement. The Port Huron Statement included a number of criticisms that reflected the old left, things like the protesting the power of big business or the corruption of government or the militarism of society with its arms race. But it also had a broader critique of American society, sort of expressing a yearning for a more genuine human relationships. It read, for example, quote, "We would replace power rooted in possessions, privilege, or circumstances with power rooted in love, reflectiveness, reason, and creativity." You know, citing the civil rights movement, the Port Huron Statement envisioned a nonviolent youth movement, sort of transforming the U.S. into a, quote, true participatory democracy, unquote. They wanted to eliminate all of its social ills, careerism, materialism, militarism, racism, all the isms. The Port Huron Statement was drafted by a 22-year-old former editor at the University of Michigan student newspaper, Tom Hayden. Hayden became president of the National SDS in 1962, and by then the SDS had 9 chapters across the nation and about 1,000 student members. The SDS, however, never had a strong central organization, perhaps reflecting its rather broad and somewhat vague manifesto. At the outset, the SDS focused mainly on the civil rights movement and combating the Cold War. I should note that Hayden, by the way, later married the actress Jane Fonda and served in the California State Assembly. Soon after the founding of SDS, the free speech movement began at the University of California at Berkeley. Pushed on by a number of conservative groups, the university administration banned all rallies and activist tables and whatnot, which had traditionally been set up around the main gate to the university. People there had been handing out flyers saying that the government was wrong on civil rights and everything. On October 1st, 1964, matters sort of came to a head when the administration ordered the university police to arrest Jack Weinberg, a graduate student who had defied the ban and was still handing out civil rights leaflets. The police dragged Weinberg to a nearby police car, but the students began to protest and they completely surrounded the car. Thousands showed up, and for 32 straight hours, they wouldn't let the car move. The protesters were galvanized by a 21-year-old philosophy student, Mario Savio, who climbed on top of the police car and began making protest speeches. After the administration decided to let Weinberg go and thus defuse the situation, the ban, however, still remained in place. The campus then was rocked by a number of sit-ins and rallies and a strike by over 70% of the students. The Berkeley administration finally decided to reject the ban in 1965, but by then signs of protest and student activism had spread to other campuses, which formed their own free speech movements. I should note that the California governor at the time, Ronald Reagan, was a vocal critic of the free speech movement and all the student protesters. Of course, in time, the New Left would grow beyond the SDS and the free speech movement and begin to be involved in things like the anti-Vietnam War movement. As a matter of fact, today you generally think of the New Left, you associate with symbols such as the peace sign. Now, the peace sign was first developed by a man named Gerald Hawthorne in 1958 for the British nuclear disarmament movement. It drew from a Sycamore Technology System symbol for N, meaning nuclear, and D, meaning disarmament. Sycamore technology is a system of conveying information at a distance by means of visual signals, like things like handheld flags or paddles. Anyway, the symbols were incorporated for N and D into this peace sign, and they never copyrighted it, and the New Left sort of adopted it as a general symbol of peace. And when the Vietnam War came along, of course, it was a sign of the peace symbol against the Vietnam War. The peace sign of using fingers also became associated with the New Left. It was originally an insult sign when used with the palm facing inwards. During World War II, the British adopted it as a sign for victory, using the palm facing outwards. This was at first employed by a Belgian politician in exile in England in 1941. It was adopted by the New Left in the anti-Vietnam War movement because it was connected to the end of war. I should note that it is now the number 2 sign in the American Sign Language, by the way. To conclude the New Left, I should note that what drove it all throughout its history was the association with famous people, intellectuals, writers, artists, and musicians. Certainly you can see cultural leaders like shown here, John Lennon and his wife Yoko Ono. That spurred on and made the New Left even more popular with young people. This concludes this section introducing the New Left and showing how it began with the SDS and the free speech movement.